You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. How do you honor a legacy of strength, sacrifice, and survival? Hear this powerful family story in today's episode. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore the profound impact of war and political upheaval on one family's journey across generations. Our guest shares his mother's story of surviving Mao's Cultural Revolution, the struggles she endured, and how those experiences shaped both her life and the life of those who came after her. Richard Perkins Hsung was born in China in 1966 and was one of the first teens to leave China legally after Mao's Cultural Revolution. He earned a PhD in chemistry from the University of Chicago and became a professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, retiring in 2022. He spent 10 years editing and completing Spring Flower by his mother, Dr. Jean Trenois Perkins. The 3-volume memoir chronicles her life as an adopted child of American medical missionaries, survivor of China's brutal communist regime, ophthalmologist, immigrant, and mother. Richard lives in Madison, Wisconsin with his wife, where keeping squirrels from digging up his backyard has become a daily scientific obsession. Here is my interview with Richard Perkins Hsung. Hi, Richard. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because we will be talking about From the Ashes of War today, and you will actually be telling not your own story, but your mother's story. So I'm very excited to have you here today and so honored to have you share that story with us today. Thanks for joining us on the podcast and welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on your show.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And like I said, I feel so blessed and honored that you're here today because a lot of these stories we don't actually get to hear. And so to talk about that for an episode and actually find out what happened, what that was like, and the personal journey that also affects you today, it's such a wonderful thing. So let's start with maybe what we'll be talking about today and give our readers a little bit of an insight of whose story are we sharing today? How does that connect to you? And maybe a bit of an overview of what we'll be sharing.
Yes, so I guess I completed my mother's memoir, which turned out to be a 3-volume memoir. My mother had started writing about her life back in early 1980s. She spent about 12 years on that. And then shortly before she passed away, and I promised her that I would complete her memoir. And then I didn't know it would take me 10 more years to complete that. So essentially, it's a story of her life. She's an ordinary human being, but she lived an unordinary life, mainly because she encountered some very interesting historical events. And most importantly, she was I had a fortune of encountering a number of extraordinary people, and that was the impetus for her to actually write her memoir. The memoir is to honor these people. So,
yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we'll start off with maybe the beginning of her story. Now, you told me that the memoirs that she left behind were in order, so in chronological order, and they kind of follow along. So maybe let's start in the beginning of the story to give our listeners an idea of where this starts off, when this starts off, and who it starts off with, so we can set the scene a little bit and historically and culturally dive into where this memoir came from.
Right. So my mother was born in 1931, and that's when the book starts. And she was born into a dirt poor farmer's family. And in a small town on the northern banks of Yangtze River, one of the longest river in China or Asia or in this world. And shortly after she was born, there was a flood. That river has flooded many, many times in Chinese history, but that one was one of the worst, and also turned out to be one of the worst natural disasters in the 20th century. It killed about upwards of 4 million people, from drowning to starvations and infectious diseases thereafter. And so my mother's biological parents, particularly her biological mother, was trying to give her away because they couldn't afford another mouth to feed. And so they went to the southern banks of the river, directly across the river. It turned out there was a American medical missionary couple who had to build a hospital in that tiny little village or fishing village. And so this American medical missionary couple adopted my mom. And so my mom was 10 months old. And so my mother grew up then in essentially American family, or raised by Americans. And that's where the story began, and winding through about half a century, ending in 1980 when my mother came to America. Actually, she called America home because she had stayed in Yonkers, New York during World War II. And when she came back to America, she brought me over to the States as well. So about 50 years or so of her life.
Wow. And touching on that scene of the flooded river and how the whole story starts as already gives us an idea of how it continued the next 50 years. And did your mother have siblings in China, or was she an only child?
So yes, she technically should have had 13 brothers and sisters, and she was number seven or number eight, so she would have six or seven older brothers and sisters. And she, in her later life, she actually got to know two of her older brothers and one older sister. Although the interactions were at best limited, but she knew their existence.
Mm,
She had fleeting connections to her biological family for the ensuing 50 years or so.
mm. And how did that continue when she was adopted by the Americans that were
Yeah.
there? So she was very young at that time,
Yeah.
just 10 months old. So did they stay in China with her, or did they leave? Or how does the story continue after they adopt her?
Well, maybe I should wind the clock back even further before 1931. So it will be I guess, my American grandparents. So my American grandfather was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, in one of the bluest blood New England family, very wealthy and powerful family. My American grandmother was actually Scottish, born and raised in Edinburgh before immigrated to Canada first and then to the States. And so in 1916, they were married, and my American grandfather was a surgeon, actually specialized in infectious diseases. And so they decided to dedicate their lives to to a Christian mission, and they chose Asia, and ultimately they ended up in China, and they were in this again fishing village directly across from the river from my where my mother was initially born, and they built this hospital and used their own money. They, along with hundreds of other Western missionaries, were some of the kindest people ever existed, right? And I was telling you too earlier, that the book, the memoir, is to honor some of these extraordinary people, and that will include my American grandparents. And so my mother then was surrounded by Westerners and English-speaking Westerners. So English was really technically her first language, if not native language. And she lived an idyllic childhood in the house that my grandparents built in that town. And going to elementary schools, kindergarten, elementary schools, English-speaking schools. And before they were uprooted and migrated to America because of World War II, right? So, yeah, so I think she was one of the lucky ones alive. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm very happy to hear that she had actually a very idyllic childhood, despite everything that was going on at the time and the situation that was going on. So I'm very glad to hear that she had those pieces, those formative pieces in her young years that were at least good memories. And going from there, so World War II, she was born, you said, in 1931, right? So it wasn't much after that, not even 10 years after that, World War II really broke out and sort of officially started. So when her parents, her adoptive parents, returned to America because of that, did she join them as well?
Yes, so 1930, around 37, 38, Japanese invaded the southern part of China. And so Japan was already taking over most part of Asia. But America and Britain were not at war with Japan. So my grandparents stayed on, kept their hospital open, functional, because Japanese soldiers would need healthcare, I guess, so to speak. But Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941, and then America officially entered the war. And so there was this historical POW exchange orchestrated by Japan, Imperial Japan, and America. But the deal was brokered by Switzerland and Spain. Both countries were not participants of the war. So Spain represented Japan and Switzerland represented America. And so President Roosevelt was trying to get all the American personnel home, repatriate them because these are all diplomats or business people or like my grandparents, missionaries, scattered in the Asian territories they were occupied by Japanese armies. And then, of course, from American side, Roosevelt rounded up many so-called Japanese prisoners, but technically many of them were second or third generation Japanese Americans. Right? That was extremely unconstitutional, except we were at war. What can you do? Right? So my mother was able to leave China with my American grandparents, with her American adopted American parents, mainly because she was actually legally adopted in the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court station in Shanghai in 1940. So she had all the documents and paperwork, like a passport, essentially. And so she became one of the two Chinese nationals exchange with this so-called historical exchange with so-called Japanese PO prisoners from America. And it was the first exchange, a couple of exchanges like this. The first exchange involved 1,500 Americans. And she was one of the two, I guess, really Chinese nationals. And so, yeah, so then she landed in New York Harbor and spent the next 3 years in Yonkers, New York, finishing off her elementary school and junior high in Yonkers, New York. That period basically solidified her identity as American, and English was her first language. So,
Yeah, wow, what a historic time that she lived through and the events that we read about in books today, but really we don't know personally what that was like. So she was part of some very historical events that were well known throughout the world. And you and I, we touched briefly before the recording on the fact that when we moved to a different country, and so your mom did speak English at that time when she moved there already, but even that change in culture and the change in country can be can be very jarring on your identity. So, how did your mother integrate when she actually came to the US? Because she did go to international schools and she did speak English, but I'm guessing that being in China and being in the US were still two things that might have been a little bit different. How was that for her to actually come to the US and start integrating there?
Yeah, that's an awesome question because she was surrounded again by Westerners and English, and she attended English speaking schools in China, but that was still just China, right? It was a war torn and famine stricken, just very poor, impoverished China. And so when she first saw Manhattan, New York City, she was just blown away, right? I mean, it's otherworldly. It's like another alien planet. And yeah, so she was ecstatic. Everything was extremely exciting to her and quickly became she fell in love with the city, New York City. And so, yeah, so I think those 3 years perhaps were the happiest time in her entire life.
Yeah. And how old was she then? So they came over at the beginning of the war. When was the exchange
So
made?
that first POW exchange completed in August 1942.
Mhm.
And so, yes, so between 1942 and 1945, so she spent 3 years in Yonkers, New York. And she left America with her parents because when I guess, the European part of the World War II ended, European theater ended, on VE Day in May of 1945, her parents decided it's time for them to go back to China to continue their Christian mission work. And then they didn't think about leaving her in Yonkers and just thought about bring her with them back to China. So she would have been, what, 1942? She would have been 11 years old, going to Yonkers, leaving around 14 or 15.
Yeah, those are really formative years when usually you have some close knit friends and a group that you know and that you're familiar with. And she wouldn't have had any of that in the US coming at age 11 and then being taken out of that environment again just a few years later. So was she very close then with your grandparents, her parents, and her adoptive parents, and they formed a relationship that was very close? Or how did your mother feel about not having that network that you usually have with your friends at that point?
Yeah, so I think she was heartbroken leaving Yonkers, but what ultimately overcame her anxiety or feelings was because she was extremely close to her parents, especially her mom. And so wherever her parents were going to be, that will be home. So she got over her sadness of leaving all of her friends and classmates in Yonkers, New York. Yeah, like what you said, those were formative years, right? She was coming of age, becoming an all-American teenager. And she was, what, seventh or eighth grade. And she fancied herself becoming a journalist, an author, a writer, because I guess her American side of family had produced many authors and writers, and that was what she wanted to do. And the next thing you know, literally on VE Day, that's May 8th, 1945 to be more precise, she was on a battleship en route to Africa because the Pacific Theater, Japan hadn't surrendered yet in 1945. So they had to enter China from the western border. So they went to Africa and then India and attempting to get into China from Burma. And so they can. There were no real our normal transportations, especially naval ships, except naval ships, and would take them. So that was also another interesting tidbit, I guess. Yeah.
Wow, what a journey. That's a long way. As if you think you're coming from New York on the East Coast, you have to come all the way across the Atlantic, go
Yes.
all the way around the bottom of Africa, and then try and get into China. What a journey.
We passed the Strait of Galbator. How do you pronounce that word? The Strait of.
Gibraltar. I know what you mean, Gibraltar.
Yes,
I
I'm
think.
sorry,
Yeah.
Gibraltar, yeah. And then the Swiss Canal, and
Yeah.
so they stayed in Egypt for a little bit
Oh,
before they
okay.
went to Mumbai in India. Technically, they were supposed to go straight to Burma and enter from the western border of China, China's western border. But because people told them don't go back to China because China was still at war. And so they actually ended up staying in India for a year. My grandparents did some medical mission work in India, and my mother attended school at a British boarding school in the Himalayas. And that was another interesting experience that she had. And she met a lot of
Wow.
people, a lot of British, a lot of Indian kids. Yeah.
It's easy to forget that she was just a teenager at that point, taking
Started
on this
travel around the
huge
world. Yeah.
voyage, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. I guess that would have been a bit of a surprise to see that the war had technically ended with the US and also with Europe, and then come back to China and see that there the war was still going and it was still actually a really dangerous and volatile situation.
Right. And ultimately, they went back to China in the mid or summer of 1946, after about a year in India. Japan had just surrendered at that time. So, and then my American grandparents went straight back to the hospital they built and opened it up and continued their mission work. And my mom went back to well, attended, I guess, high school by that time, English speaking high school in that town. And so I think she readapted to her to her new old surrounding, I guess.
Yeah. Did she write anything in her notes or manuscripts how she felt about that change? Having these dreams and visions of the future, wanting to become a journalist and being in the US and sort of having that door wide open for her, and then going back to China, where I would imagine the situation didn't change much after the war. There was probably still a lot of hunger and poverty and famine and suffering and these contrasting pieces. How did she deal with that in her own health, her mental health? That would have been such a jarring change for her.
She had a photographic memory, even though I know she cheated by reading many letters that her mother had written, because her mother had to prepare all these reports back to United Methodist Church, which is what they were, Methodist missionaries. But still, my mother had a very good memory and remembering so many details of her childhood. And she clearly stated that she was really angry for quite some time, being uprooted from Yonkers. And, and literally, none of her classmates and best friends knew what happened to her. She just disappeared into thin air. And next thing you know, she was in India. She enjoyed her time in the Himalayas, but at the same time, now back to China. I mean, India wasn't that much better, but China was again a war-torn, famine-stricken, and impoverished place. And she had a hard time getting used to the surrounding, even though it was an English-speaking high school and that was built by missionaries. But there were a lot of lessons and courses in Chinese, right? Chinese history had to be taught in Chinese. She didn't understand a word of Chinese by that time, and let alone speaking and understanding. And so yeah, so she had a hard, she struggled in school and outside the courses and taught in English. And she actually resented the whole process. And even till when she came back to the States and brought me over, there were times she would tell me that her meaning that her American parents never thought about how she felt about the situation. They just uprooted her, thinking that she should be with them. Of course, she was a minor.
Yeah, these are some of the challenges that a lot of people as immigrants to different countries still face today. These challenges with culture and the situation, accommodation, school, language, all of those things. So I can only imagine how much more difficult that would have been going back to a war-torn country where the setting is so
Right.
much more challenging and difficult as well. And did your mother stay in China for a long time? Did her parents decide to keep doing their missionary work there, or did that situation also get to a point where they decided to come back to the States?
Well, so that's where my mom's life took a U-turn. I was telling you that my mother had a charmed, idyllic childhood, and then it really enjoyed her time in America, and even including traveling around the world as a teenager. But 1946, then China began a civil war between the communist armies, and then the government is called Republican Nationalist. And the US was trying to broker a deal to have a two-party system, and that never worked out. So for the next 3 years, China was mired in the civil war. And my grandparents managed to keep the hospital open, but pretty soon, communist armies swept through southern part of China. And the Yangtze River really geographically is more on the southern part of China. And so they thought about fleeing at the time, and then they tried to get my mother out, and that was unsuccessful. And then they end up staying because communists took over overnight, literally overnight, right? And that town became a communist territory. And it turned out that communist armies were okay. They respected people, they respected foreigners, but mainly because they needed a hospital and they needed a competent physicians. So they allowed my grandparents to keep the hospital operational, and then they did not do anything to them until a year later. This would be 1950. Communists took over the entire China in 1949, the fall of 1949. So in 1950, suddenly a Korean conflict came to the fore, and that's a proxy war between America and China on Korean Peninsula, essentially. And so my American grandparents were driven out of China overnight. At that time, my mother was a freshman in college, in an English-speaking college, 300 miles away. She couldn't make it back. So she was trapped in China. As my American grandparents made their way to Canton and later on Hong Kong and back to the States, my mother was left behind. And so my mother then spent the next 30 years in China.
Yeah, just this is absolutely incredible. And I guess she must have written about those 30 years as well, having had this impact on her that she was suddenly separated from really the only family that she had known her whole life and she was really, really close to. And she was, again, not very old at this point. She was, like you said, just in college. It was the beginning of her 20s, so she was such a young woman still. I'm curious about how that affected her in the sense that women were maybe not as much respected in China at that time, and also their standing being maybe unmarried and things like that. How did that impact your mother, just being there as a young single woman all of a sudden on her own without her family?
Yeah, so historically, China, maybe in many other countries on this planet, have not treated women or girls, I guess, use the word, they have not treated women and girls with respect, right? And they're in China, the girls and women are regarded as second-class citizens, right? And that I have to give credits to Western missionaries. Their presence really raised the awareness of human rights, especially the rights of women, to education and healthcare. Instead of when they were born when they find out it's a girl, they just throw them on the roadside, let them to die. So the government actually did a better job of treating women, young women like my mother at the time in college, a 19-year-old freshman in college. And also my mother was lucky, along with other people of her age, male or female. China recognized, the communist government recognized they need two types of professions. One is teacher, the other is physicians. And so they, for that first few years, they decided to give free educations to all those kids in 18, 19, 20-year-olds, or whoever were already in college, allow them to finish free of charge. And so that was the first turn of event, even though my mother's life had made a U-turn being separated from her American parents. And that was a traumatic experience. And she suddenly found herself completely broke, penniless, but yet there's this order coming down from the central government that education is free. And just finish your whatever you're assigned to. And she was assigned to complete her medical school. Yeah, so she became a physician in the process, ophthalmologist, eye doctor in the process. And so, yeah, so in that sense is fortunate, unexpected, but fortunate. That was her first step trying to survive, I guess, in communist China. Yeah.
Yeah. What a turn from wanting to be a journalist to becoming a physician. So,
Yeah.
what a change for her.
But
Yeah.
she also made a comment in her book and sometimes to me casually to say, once I got stuck in China, my Chinese was so bad that effectively ended my dream of becoming a writer or a journalist. And so pursuing a profession in medicine and which is more or less science based was probably wiser or at least easier because she ultimately was a foreigner in her own birth country. So
Yeah, absolutely. And also without her family there, right? She was effectively abandoned in a country that shut
right.
its doors. So yeah, I would imagine that you don't have a lot of choices. You make those choices based on what is best for your own survival. So
Exactly. The word
yeah,
survival is
yeah,
survival.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense that she would have chosen that route. And did she have contact with her adoptive parents at all during this time that she was stuck in China, or was that not possible for her?
Some, they obviously wrote to each other constantly, mostly between her mother and her father wrote some, but there'll be letters from, I guess, from my American grandmother almost weekly. But she didn't receive more than half of those, right? And because they were all censored, even though they were coming by ways of Hong Kong, but still later on years when she opened up boxes of things left behind by her mother, she will find all these letters that she had never seen before. Because in those days, when people type a letter, there'd be carbon copies. So there'd be like a triplicates, right? So there's all these copies of original letters that she's never seen. And then she will find some of her letters to her mother, but not all of them were there. So until 1954, by that time, Korean conflict had ended. So there was some hope, except my American grandparents loved Chinese people, loved China so much. They decided if they couldn't get into China, mainland China, the best they could do is go to Taiwan and continue to help Chinese people. But the mistake was that Taiwan was enemy of the state of that communist regime, right? So then when they went to Taiwan, my mother didn't dare to write to them at all. Right? So they lost touch with one another after 1954.
Wow. Yeah, I'm letting that sink in because if you imagine all of a sudden, not only are you stuck in a country where you have trouble speaking the language, your family is far away from you, but then you also must stop communicating with them. I can't even imagine the heartbreak that brought for your mother. And did she talk about how that affected her and what she did to help herself through those times to move forward and survive, as you said before?
Yeah, so it was interesting to read what she had written and continue to edit and write about her life because I've never seen that side of her that she was a human being. My mother was, to me, was brilliant and smart, and this person who was very brave and courageous and also very cold, right? Because of she hardly ever showed her emotional side to me. And then suddenly I would read what she had written, and she was scared and she was lonely. She yearned for her mom, her parents. She was this human being, right? It's like, oh my goodness, that was good. It's good for me to see that side of her. And yes, so she struggled immensely in every way. And the way to survive, of course, she was smart, right? She tried to then relearn the language, try to blend in and try to get rid of her Chinese, try to get rid of her American accent when she spoke Chinese, which is just bizarre, right? Because people constantly ask her, "Where are you from? Where is that accent from?" Oh, it's from some rural town you don't know about. And so then the other thing she did was she befriended my father. So what can you do, right? You marry a local. And that's one way to survive. And I believe there is some level of true love there, or I want to believe that, but I believe that was also her strategy of keep herself, afloat in a country that where she was really a foreigner, and she saw everything. She witnessed so many things during those 30 years, essentially through the lens of Westerner, even though she was Chinese.
That's actually really a good point, yeah, because her whole upbringing was so different than anyone who would have been raised in China, Chinese with the Chinese
Yeah,
language and all that. So that is interesting that you say that. But yeah, it would have been like having a Westerner perspective in a country that is your birth country, but you'd feel differently about that, I guess. And
right.
I wonder if the fact that she seemed maybe colder was a protection for her also because she couldn't have those vulnerabilities or those emotions because it wasn't conducive to the survival part, I would guess. So yeah, a lot
Right
of
on.
a lot of people that experience trauma, that's what happens, right? So
Yeah. Mhm.
wow.
My father
Mm.
made a comment to me. This is shortly before I left China and came to the States with my mom. And my father said, "Your mother used to be one of the kindest and warmest human beings I ever met. Used to be." And so that spoke volume in the sense that the 30 years of living in China just closed her up in terms of showing her emotions. It's for survival.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but also very interesting that your father got to see that other side of her
Yes.
in the beginning, right? Yeah. The one that you only got to read about and
Yes.
he experienced that. So, yeah, I feel sadness, at the fact that people have to do that to protect themselves and have to do that to survive in these situations and lose, I guess, a part of themselves, which was the kindness and the joy and the connection to life and like that idyllic childhood that she had, right, where she had great memories. So yeah, that seems very, very sad to me, and that she had to experience it in that way for 30 years. So you were born then in China because at first you weren't in the States. So you were actually born in China as well.
Yes.
And how was that experience for you being born into the communistic country? And so were you raised with Chinese language and all the Chinese traditions, or was that more of a Western take from your mother's side, or how did that work for you?
Completely Chinese. So I was born at the onset of Mao's famous or infamous proletarian cultural revolution in mid-1960s, 1966, I guess. I think I was born shortly before that. And that was a revolution. You can also use another word, it's a cultural genocide, right? Specifically against highly educated, creative people. So my father was a director of a research institute at the time, a professor in agriculture, and he had spoken out loudly against the government about a decade earlier. So he was sent to labor camp almost instantly. And my mother's upbringing as religious, with her religious background and also having lived in America and raised by Americans, she was at the top of the list, the persecution list. But because again, she was a physician, right? So they allowed her to stay in the hospital to continue working, even though she was constantly sent away to some reform or rustication program. So neither of them dared to tell me or my older sister anything about their past life. And so I knew nothing about anything for the first 14 years of my life. But of course, we were extremely poor. Everyone was poor in China. And the revolution essentially sacked China economically in every way and culturally also in every way. And so, again, we were back to impoverished China. But over those first 10, 14 years of my life, yeah, I knew nothing about anything else besides what's around me, Chinese culture and I guess Chinese language. And I attended Chinese speaking schools until my mother brought me out here to America and she began to tell me her life, her previous life, I guess.
Yeah, this is so incredible to hear. And did your father join you coming to the US? Because you said that he was sent away. So was he effectively then kept in China or was he able to leave
Yeah,
as
so
well?
he spent about 6 years in jail and in jail or Stalinist gulag. And he was released the early 1970s, and the Mao's Cultural Revolution ended in 1976. And in 1978, China reopened to the West. China had closed its border with the exception of a few countries it had interactions with or diplomatic relationships with, complete closed to the world, particularly the Western part of the world, I guess. But 1978, when they reopened and the Westerners poured in, and I think it was a American physician from Mass General Hospital in Boston found my mother and just found her life stories fascinating and also her New York accent, right? So then this person helped my mother return to America. And at that time, China was still very tight in terms of giving out passports for people to leave the country, especially private passports to leave. And my father, although he was out of jail, he was his job and title were given back to him, but he had to stay. So he stayed behind with my sister. So my family was split in half. Main reason was also because my father and my mother wanted the Chinese government to know that there was no way we're going to immigrate to America. We will come back after a 2 to 3 year stay as a visiting scholar to Mass General Hospital. We will come back. And the reason we'll come back is because the half of family is still here. And so I didn't get to see my father for quite some time. I didn't get to see my sister ever again for another 20 years. So we were just split apart.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely incredible. And I guess you had to make some sort of gesture of goodwill because they were quite mistrusting if they let you out of the country for something and that you wouldn't come back at that time. So, wow. And it's still all about survival at that point, also for your mother, and knowing that she had to leave her child behind. I imagine that that must have been just broken her inside, and I don't know if she talked about that, but I'm sure she would have felt that.
So she was determined to flee, essentially, even though we had all the proper documents, passport and visa. So we came to the state. We left China legally. We came to the States legally. But she had to be pretty cold because, again, right, that's a side I saw until I started working on her memoir. Her daughter or my older sister would have been 19 years old, exactly the same age as when her parents were driven out of China during the height of Korean conflict in 1950. So there's a lot of mirroring and similarities or deja vu, repeat of history there. But my mother decided that she had to come out first and then regain her citizenship and then start immigrating the rest of the family. But it was turned out to be much more difficult than she ever had imagined. And so my sister didn't come out till early 2000s, 25 years after the fact. My father didn't immigrate till late 1990s. So Took a long time. But
Yeah.
at the time, that wasn't what was on her mind. Fleeing China, leaving all of this behind was foremost on her mind. And then bringing me out here with her was a very good strategy, or a lot of foresight to it. But again, it split the family into two halves, and I think she understood later in later years that we could never recover from something like that. The family could never
Yeah.
recover from something like that.
I was going to ask about that because I feel like that is a distance that would be very difficult to bridge because their lives continued in a very different way, in a very different place. And how do you reconcile that completely different experience that you have for 20 years, living a totally different life, and then reconcile that back into one family? That would have been immensely difficult, if not impossible.
We never did. And again, back to your earlier question, I know I sort of digressed and rambled. After I was born, my father was in jail. So I didn't know who the hell he was, pardon my language, he was until early 1970s, mid 70s. And by the time when he and I were trying to have a relationship, I left. And so my father and I never had much of a relationship, non-existent. And then, of course, I knew my sister pretty well first part of my life. And then after 20 years of separation with very little interaction, I lost track of who she had become, and vice versa. And so yeah, so we yeah, so just that's why I look at today's situation, whether in America, or in Europe, or you know, no one in their right mind will uproot the whole family or part of the family and then abandon their native land, motherland, abandon their native language and go somewhere else and start over, and at the same time of being separated from part of their family members. And if not for fleeing persecutions, war, atrocities, disasters, man-made disasters,
Yeah.
that's what happened.
Yeah. Wow. I want to ask how that impacted you now that you look back. And so you lived a life in the US then when you came with your mother. And I would imagine you had quite a few doors open for you then as well to actually choose what you wanted to do versus, living in China. So, how did that impact you from a sense that your sister never got those same opportunities? How was that for you feeling that? Or did you even think about that? Or was that something that you accepted as just being part of that life and that situation that you were in?
Well, very much like my mother, who was uprooted from her junior high school in Yonkers, New York in 1945. I resented leaving my father and my sister behind. I resented coming to America, a country I knew nothing about. And even years later, I would still tell my mother that she should never have uprooted me because those were my formative years, right? And that was strange. After Mao's Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, which also decimated educational system, China reinstituted school systems and college systems and so on. So I was, seventh, eighth grade also. At that time, I became a pretty good writer in Chinese, and I wanted to write and become a journalist. And so as soon as we landed in JFK, that effectively ended that dream, right? Because I didn't know a word of English. And it was on that Pan Am flight from Tokyo to JFK, my mother tried to tell me her life story. And I was just totally shocked, just completely blown away by what she was telling me. I'm thinking, this my mother, right? And of course, right, by the time we landed in JFK, my mom was speaking with very fluent English, and I realized she wasn't lying to me. But I didn't know a word of English, and it was a total struggle trying to assimilate myself into this new culture, new environment, new language. And it took years, if not decades, especially the first 20 years in America. So, but I guess I'm older now. I realize it was a good idea for my mom to bring me out. I appreciate that. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the career I ultimately end up pursuing in teaching chemistry and all that. But the price we all paid for that. I constantly think about this too. Was that worth it? Truly worth it? I guess my mother's answer would be, of course, Richard. But for me, I guess sometimes I'm ambivalent. So,
Yeah.
not because I'm ungrateful, it's just ambivalent. I thought about what if I'd have stayed in China? Or what would I have become? Just like what she thought about. What if her parents allowed her to finish high school in Yonkers, New York, and 10 college in America?
Isn't that an interesting insight that you effectively went through the same thing as your mother? She wanted to be a journalist and then was torn out of that and couldn't speak Chinese to become a journalist. And you spoke Chinese, wanted to become a journalist, and then were torn out of that, but didn't speak English to
Yes.
pursue that at first. So, but that story actually mirrors each other in such a close way.
Complete opposite way, but mirrors, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And those are some of the things that I'm glad that you're touching on, because I think that ambivalence is something we have to grapple with in those situations when we don't know what the outcome would have been had we made a different choice, right? We don't know. And if different
Yeah.
choices had been made for us. So
Right. No.
there's that question that remains, right? And when we don't know and when we have to come to terms with that unknown and somehow in our lives and make the best of that.
Yeah. I mean, we can always think about what if, but there is no what if in real life, and no control studies, right? So, but except that
That's true.
that's yeah, except that's what happened. And of course, my sister then went through a completely different route. And by the time she immigrated to America, she wondered what if at the time she was the one who came out. So I, I would tell her not to worry about any of that because because I'm not so sure I'm totally appreciative of that experience even today. But yeah, that would be another what if. That would be an opposite what if for her. So right.
Yeah. And the family dynamics that you're dealing with at that point, too, right? With having family growing up in China, continuing their lives there. And then, as we touched on before, trying to all of a sudden make that work in a different environment coming to the US. So, did your father then later rejoin the family as well? Did everyone actually live together again in the States, or did that not really work out that way?
My father finally got his green card, so to speak, mid 1990s, and then he decided to formally live in America late 1990s, because at that time my mother started to show signs of early dementia, and she had already suffered through some deep depression, and I attributed that depression to writing this memoir, and that's where she stopped writing. That's when she stopped writing. So, and my father decided to formally retire from his post, and he had to become no bragging, but he had to become a world-renowned agronomist and risen through the ranks in China to a very high post, equivalent of, I guess, some kind of position in the department or ministry or department of agriculture in China. Very well known. But he decided to abandon all of that and to come out to technically, in part, taking care of my mom, so to speak. So then, about 5, 6, 7 years later, my sister came out. And so there was a reunion photo finally, 25 years after we were separated from one another.
Wow. Yeah. I still feel so much sadness in the whole story. The not knowing, the ambivalence, all of that. It creates a touch of sadness.
The tragedy
Yeah.
in so many strange ways, and especially the last. Technically, my mother lived another 35 years in the United States of America, but those 33 decades or so presented a complete different set of challenges, and one that she was very ill. She was completely unprepared, ill-prepared. And she thought it was just going to be repatriation, get her citizenship, and the whole family would be reunited within a matter of months or years, or a few years. But it turned out to be a quarter of a century to do just that. But again, her life amounted to be a tragedy, but she was able to live through all of that. It's because she had the fortune, again, meeting a lot of people. And this would, I would include my father as one of them, because technically he sort of saved her back in early 1950s, a foreigner in her own birth country and trying to hang on and not knowing how long the separation from her own American parents will be and how long the Korean War will be and how she would continue living in China and then later on through this tumultuous Cultural Revolution. And surviving all of that, there were a lot of people reached out helping us, and even including our passports were provided by some high-ranking communist officials who actually reach across the aisle or ideological line and try to help us. That helped my mother to flee in 1980, leaving China. So really, the memoir tried to accentuate these people that actually allowed her to survive for those decades. During actually one of the most grossly inhumane period in 20th century.
Yeah. And the human connections that prevailed to make that happen and help her come back out of China. And also the connection to her adoptive parents, which was a very strong and loving connection. Did she physically see her parents when she came back to the US, or had they passed away by that time?
They passed away. My American grandfather passed away in 1958. Grandmother passed away in 1963. When they adopted my mother, they were already well into their 40s. They were not spring chicken, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And that would have been a long time for them to hang on and hope for her to come back. So, wow. Yeah. And tell us a little bit about the promise that you made your mother then, and the whole reason why we're talking today, and the memoirs that she left, the manuscripts and the notes for you. What was the promise that you made her then?
Yeah, so it was early 2014. I visited my mom in the nursing home. She had been there for about 10 years or so already. And then she was suffering from dementia, but she wouldn't just die. Many people suffering from Alzheimer's, they would die within years. But my mom seemed to just hang on. So I asked her a question. I said, why are you still here? Why wouldn't you just be free on the other side? Of course, by that time, she didn't recognize who I was and wouldn't be able to, I wasn't communicating with anyone. And so it was a monologue. And then while I was leaving, I said, and I remember you haven't finished your memoir. So maybe, and you were wondering who would do that. So maybe I will help you finish that if you would just go in peace. And that was just, I guess, in some way, it was a naive and casual sort of promise, right? It was just a one-sided conversation. But lo and behold, she died a couple months later, as if she heard my promise. And I was left holding the bag, thinking, my goodness, what am I going to do with this promise? But I inherited her writing, her manuscripts, and those 1,000 pages. My father handed those 3 boxes to me. He says, "It's all yours now." Actually, my father then confessed to me that he was trying to help her finish the memoir, but in Chinese. And then he said, within a month, I realized this is impossible. So it's all yours now. And so, yeah, so I began to dig into everything she had and began working on that. And I didn't know it would take 10 years, but, but it did. Yeah.
I feel like the story comes full circle here. So you're back being a journalist, writing the memoir. So the circle feels like it's closing a little bit at that point, with you returning to those roots that you really wanted to follow. So I'll ask you before we wrap up, What has that process been like for you? I mean, you're reading documents, sort of intimate and emotional moments of a person that you may have not even seen that way, your own mother, getting to know things about her that you may have never even known before, and finding out things that you had no idea happened, and reconnecting with all of those things. What was that journey like for you emotionally and mentally? What was that like for you?
I guess in one word, exhausting, physically, mentally, emotionally. And I definitely crashed a couple of times. And that's how I look back on her process of writing her memoir, why I attributed her depression in the early 1990s to the writing of this book. But now that I've come around to it, I will also claim it has been very redemptive for me to see, of course, to learn about my family history, heritage, both Chinese and American, and to learn the other side of my mother, the side I rarely saw, and redemptive also just to I guess I carried, unbeknownst to me, I carried a lot of burdens on my shoulder over those decades after coming to America. And I was able to shed a few bricks from that burden, even though I'm still carrying the rest in the back. But yeah, I think like what you said too, it finally allowed me to come back in somewhat of a full circle to become a writer. And even though I would still concede that this mostly is my mother's writing her stories. So anything that would be wrong or not properly presented, it would be my mother's fault, not mine. But nonetheless, gives me a platform, a starting point, if you will, to reconsider or to contemplate maybe a future career in writing, like how I wanted it before I boarded that Pan Am flight.
Yeah, this memoir turned out to be 3 volumes. You told me before, so we can't wait for the fourth volume, which will be your story. So I said, I will invite you back to the podcast. And when you're ready, you can tell us
Oh,
about
that's a
that fourth
promise.
volume. Yeah. And it sounds like that process also was very therapeutic for you to learn about these things, reconnect with your own heritage, and like you said, let go of some of those things that you were carrying. So in that sense, it's almost like a bit of a family therapy, you getting to know things and you processing things that you were carrying with you all this time. So yeah, and
Turned out to be
maybe,
that. I
yeah,
wasn't expecting it, but it became that way. Yes.
yeah. So maybe that fourth volume will be the next step in that in that circle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing your mother's story with us, and remind our listeners what the title of the memoir is. Is it one title for all 3 of them, or do they all 3 have sort of a separate title?
The 3 volumes have their own sort of subtitle, but the overall title of the memoir is Spring Flower.
Amazing. And where can our listeners find these memoirs?
So Amazon.com, Barnes Noble, if you just type in Spring Flower and then my mother's name, Jean Perkins, and it will show up. It'll pop up.
Perfect. And we'll, of course, be linking to that information in the show notes as well. And I just want to thank you for telling that story, not just her story, but also your story and the story of your family. And thank you to our listeners who have stayed with us for this full hour to hear this incredible and impactful story. And I would imagine that a lot of listeners can find pieces in this story that they identify with, whether these are their own challenges, their own mental health challenges, maybe growing up in places that were war torn or unsafe, or even immigrating to a new country at some point, willingly or unwillingly, and can see bits and pieces of their own stories in the story that you've told us. So thank you so very much for that. And thank you for your willingness to share that so openly. I felt very raw and vulnerable and so authentic. And we don't often get to hear those stories. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for sharing that today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. And I'll keep the door open. We'll see in volume 4. We'll see what happens. So you
I will do my
reach
best.
back out. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us today. And everyone, have a look at the show notes and find out where you can find this incredible memoir in 3 parts called The Spring Flower. And you can order that on Amazon or buy it in a bookstore and read the story for yourself. And I would imagine there's a lot more details in the story than we've had time for on the podcast today. So you can dive into the story in a bit more detail. But thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next episode. And remember to join us on the Jōrni Podcast site and sign up for our free podcast perks, where we share a lot of different details about the episodes, our production calendar. You get freebies from our guests. So pop on over there and have a look at that. And thanks so much for sticking with us today. Everyone have a lovely day. And thank you, Richard, for coming and joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.